A reading from the first book of Samuel. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up in battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard them. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior since his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord, who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the army, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" Then the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. The word of the Lord.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. So something that you may not know about me is I have a fondness for introductory icebreaker questions. I know it's not a normal interest, but I don't like the ones that have depth to them. The ones that are about, tell me about the book that changed your life, tell me about the most inspirational moments, things of that nature just aren't my cake. I prefer what I named to our vestry at one point as the petty questions. The questions that will elicit a laugh, because I personally happen to think that through laughter, we actually get to know each other a little bit more and bond more closely than we do exploring the depths of the books that we've read. Now, one of my favorite questions to ask is this. If you were a professional athlete, what comes to mind is a baseball player, what would your walkout song be? You know the song when you're coming up to bat, that song that is meant to get you pumped up in the game, focused and ready to hit the home run. What would that song be? I'll give you 3 seconds. It'll be our coffee hour discussion, our lemonade on the lawn discussion. I'm going to ask you to tuck that away for now. But the whole purpose of that walkout song is to elicit a particular emotion, whether it's one of hype, whether it's one of focus. It is to elicit an emotion, a performance for that athlete. We know that songs have that unique ability, that they're able to touch us in ways that other things, words alone, cannot. Alzheimer's research shows us this, that as the brain is slowly eaten away by Alzheimer's disease, one of the last things that our memories retain is the memory of music. It touches us somewhere deep within. So I'm curious, what are the songs that are buried within you? Is it the song that was played on your wedding dance floor for your first dance? Is it the song your mom always played on the radio as she was cooking breakfast? Or maybe it's that song from the summer of your first job. Whatever it is, there are certain songs that shape us. Now, I'm going to sound particularly churchy for a moment, so I apologize. I think this is the place to perhaps do it. But one of those songs for me is a hymn that some of you, most of you are probably familiar with. It's a hymn that is not in the hymnal in front of you. It's the hymn, "Great is Thy Faithfulness." It's a hymn that I grew up singing in the Baptist church. It's a hymn that was played at my wedding, at my ordination. It's the hymn that was played at my dad's funeral. It has profound meaning. It is in my bones. But there's a particular version that I love most that I discovered this summer. And I know this isn't popular to say amongst Episcopalians. It is on piano, not organ. But it starts off soft and very melodic, flowing, lots of twirls. But then, as it builds, as you get to the third chorus of "Great is Thy Faithfulness," it takes a turn. It turns harsh, staccato, abrupt, as the pianist pounds out the notes for "Morning by morning, new mercies I see." In that way, it is defiant, or at least it sounds that way to me. It sounds like a claiming of a faithfulness that is yet to be seen. And as I sat with the familiar story of David and Goliath this week, I couldn't help but hear that staccato banging on the keys, that defiant proclamation of God's faithfulness. Now, I know that is not the traditional message we get with David and Goliath, right? If you grew up in Sunday school, if you are a child of the flannograph or of the singing vegetables, we are taught that this story of David and Goliath is often about David, the courageous boy, David, the one whose faith exceeded all possibilities that allowed him to courageously fight the giants. And yet, if we look in that long text we read this morning, smack dab in the middle, David tells a different story. David, in responding to the king, the one with the authority, the one who is supposed to be the best soldier, says this: "Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has defiled the armies of the living God. The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, will save me from the hand of the Philistine." Do you hear it? Do you hear the faint hymn in the background? "As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness." You see, when all of the designated leaders, the grown-ups in the room, can't look beyond the giant before them on the battlefield, it's David who is able to turn to something else. It's David who's able to get a bigger picture. It's David, the shepherd boy, who draws upon the memory of how God was with him in the wilderness, in the lowly places, in the places filled with danger and uncertainty. He, too, knew a song of God's faithfulness. But this story has a whole nother layer to it. You see, this story wasn't recorded as it was unfolding. There wasn't a scribe following David or following King Saul around, documenting everything that was said. This story is a story that was passed down generation to generation. It was told. It was spoken. And by the time it was recorded in a time when the people of God were struggling to remember who they were and who their God was. They were a people in exile, removed from all markers of their identity in a strange land. This story, as it was written, was meant to fill their imagination with the grandiosity of a God who is faithful, whose faithfulness is not at threat by our own lack of faithfulness, our own lack of faith. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. It's a song that God's people have been singing for quite some time. Now, I know we don't often find ourselves on battlefields, let alone facing a giant. If you do, please tell me. We'll have great conversation. Most of us don't even consider ourselves to be foreigners in a strange land. And we likely have never been in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, especially one in the midst of a storm. But we know what it's like to be in that boat. We know what it's like to be caught up in an unexpected storm when the waves of life are crashing in and everything seems out of control. We know what it's like to wake up each morning haunted by the voice of the giants that taunt us each day. And we probably even know what it's like to wake up in an unfamiliar life, wondering how we got to this point. We recognize and can come to recognize our voice in the cry of the disciples who say, "Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing? Jesus, come on, won't you wake up?" And it's there, in that moment, in that questioning, that we begin to hear a faint hum, that tune that comes in from a distance. Peace, be still. Now, no one tells us why or how Jesus fell asleep in the boat. Instead, we're only given what Jesus does when he does wake up. Peace, be still. And we're told those words are directed at the sea, but I can't help but wonder if Jesus, being the teacher that he was, knew his disciples would hear them, if those words were also directed at the panic, at the fear, at the overwhelm. And perhaps those words are the song that the disciples carried with them when Jesus would fall asleep again. This time not in a boat, but rather in the grave when all seemed to be lost. Peace, be still, as thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. Dear ones, do you know that song? Is that song inside of you? Has it taken hold of the depths of your inner being? We certainly have been through a storm of a year. There's no doubt about it. And the giants have well overstayed their welcome. Some of us are still in the thick of it. Some of us have been greeted by a whole nother boat that was ready to taxi us off someplace else. We all have shared this experience of being in the storm. And as we slowly walk out of it, I can't help but wonder if part of our task is to be like David, is to begin searching over those past 15 months where we have been apart, where we have had to live radically different lives, to search that experience for threads of God's faithfulness. Where have we heard those words, "Peace, be still"? I think that act of reflecting, that act of remembering is what allows us to sing that song in the uncharted waters, in the foreign land. And perhaps if we allow ourselves to follow that thread, we'll begin to see that it intersects with others, that it's actually woven together in a beautiful quilt in which we are lovingly tucked into God's faithfulness, and it is there that we find rest. That distant hum becomes notes that eventually form a melody, that become the defiance and the demanding proclamation, morning by morning, new mercies I see. Friends, this is our song. This is the song that we sing as the church. It's our song both in the storm, in the midst of giants, and in strange lands. It's also the song that we sing for each other, because we know what it's like to forget that melody from time to time. It's a song where we find both our rest and our courage, because simply put, there is nothing left for us to do but rest in God's faithfulness. One songwriter put it this way as she sought to rework that hymn. She writes this: "This is my anthem, this is my song, the theme of the stories I have heard for so long. God has been faithful, God will be again. His loving compassion knows no end. All I have needed, God's hand has provided. He's always been faithful. God's always been faithful to me." Friends, God has always been faithful to me. He has always been faithful to us. And I pray that you will know that God has and will always be faithful to you. Amen.